So today we wanted to go show you kind of an overview of one of the homesteads, and so we're going to run over there and show you around.
Welcome to the Hendrick's Homestead. So before I show you the foundations and what is left here at the homestead, I wanted to talk just a little bit about how we found out it belonged to the Hendricks family and how we are learning more about the Hendricks family as we do some more research. So the first thing that we did was we, So we went up to the courthouse and we took our parcel number for the piece of land here, and we went to one of the offices in the courthouse, and they could look up the parcel number on their computer system and find out exactly the legal description of this parcel, which is the northwest corner of section whatever, and it's really long with lots of numbers and letters in it. So we had to have that parcel number so that they could look up the legal description of the property. Once they did that, then they could pull it up in their system to see who used to live here, all the owners that this property has ever had since it became a property. So to do that, and all courthouses might be different. Ours is in a small town. It's a pretty small courthouse, but they still have all of the old books that have the records in them, like the original records of all of the properties. So once the lady that was helping us was super nice and helpful, and she looked up, she got all of our numbers, and then she pulled out the book and was able to show us the actual homestead patent for this property. So what the homestead patent is once the people that had filed the claim on the 160-acre homestead had proved up their land, then they were able to put a notice in the paper saying that we proved up our land, we have these witnesses, and we've done all the things so that this piece of land can actually be in our name now. And I know that it was different, like being able to prove up your claim was different throughout the years. So there was different regulations and stipulations on like what they had to do on the property, how much land they had to farm on that piece of property, how big their house had to be up, and how long they had to live there. There was all kinds of things like that. But once they had proved up their claim, then they could file that homestead patent and the land was theirs. So this particular homestead patent on the Hendricks property was filed in 1917. But we know from newspaper clippings that the family actually moved down here in 1910. So if you've ever looked at old newspapers from about 100 years ago, they were like the Facebook of the day. They were very intrusive, and like the stuff in them was just very nosy, I guess. But so there's all kinds of articles in there, and they've started I'm sure that they've made this advancement in other places like a long time ago, but just in the last couple years here in South Dakota, they've actually started to digitize the old microfilm and the old newspapers. So I'm able to search some of the newspapers online. I think from 1900 to 1922. From this local area, and anything past that, I'm going to have to go to the state capitol, and we're going to have to do some research at the archives there. But that's okay. We're already planning that trip, and we're excited to go. But just from those years of the newspaper clippings that I am able to read, we've been able to glean so much information off of the families. So much information off of the families that lived here and on the other homestead, and so I will be sharing those as we make these videos, and just some fun tidbits, because I don't really feel like it's history until you can like put yourself in the shoes of the person that lived there or was holding those things or was doing those things. So I hope that that'll make it interesting for you. Okay, so that's enough of the background history on this place. Let's go check out the foundations and see what's still here on the property. Okay, so I am currently standing on a pathway, and this pathway goes from the house, and it goes over to the barn, and then it goes over to some of the outbuildings that are here on the property too. It was one of the first things that I noticed when we came over to this property, besides the barn, which is still standing. But I just thought the pathway was such a cool space, because like the family would have walked on this pathway multiple times a day to get to the barn, to get to the outhouse, to get to the root cellar. Anywhere they needed to go, they would have walked on this pathway. And so the fact that it's still here and it's still mostly intact, although quite overgrown at the moment, is really cool. So we're gonna follow the pathway and we're gonna head on over to the house. I know it's hard to see because the sun is really bright today, but if you can look down here, this is the pathway that goes along the ground, and it leads right up to the foundation of the house, which is right here. All right, so our pathway seems to stop a little bit short of the house. I would guess that they did have some kind of entryway on this house. Was really, really common in South Dakota, still is very necessary with the wind and cold here. But it comes up to maybe about 6 feet, 5 feet before the house, and then it's the house. So they also could have had a deck that was on the front of the house as well. We do know from an article that we found in a history book at the library that this was a log cabin. And it said in the article that the neighbor, who we also own their old homestead as well, they came here and they helped them build this log cabin when they were trying to get moved down here. So I loved that little story, and it was just cool knowing what type of house this is, since the wood obviously no longer exists, but the foundation does, and so we can kind of picture that and imagine what it would have looked like back in the day. But I'm going to show you, so this is one corner of the foundation over here, and then the other corner is right over here. Not a very big house. We don't know if it was a 2-story house. It wouldn't have been common for a log cabin to be 2-story, but it definitely could have been. And you'll understand why when I tell you a little bit more about the family that lived here. But it was pretty small. There was a stipulation on the homestead claim that your homestead had to be at least 12 by 14. So we know that it's that size. It's definitely a little bit bigger than that. But it had to be that size. You had to have that size house on your homestead claim. It's pretty small for the family that lived here, but you may do back in the day. So we haven't really started digging too much here yet. We've dug at just a couple of spots. There is stuff all over the ground. We don't know what happened to the properties that were here, if somebody burned them or if they just fell down over the years and they moved the wood off or something. We have not found any burn marks yet, so we're not sure if the wood was burned, or we haven't found any burnt wood. So we're not sure if that was the case, but there is stuff all over the place, just on the surface of the ground, and if we scratch just a little bit under the ground, there's stuff everywhere. glass pieces of Crocs. I found a button, we found hangers, and like I said, that's just on the surface. So we're excited to get over here to the Hendrick's homestead and really start digging in here and see what we can find. So now we're gonna head over here to the root cellar, which is pretty close to the house. So the stone pathway does come over here. There's a really big stone off the side of the house, and it leads out over this way to the west, and then it leads to the root cellar, which is just behind the house over here. So we know this is the root cellar because the walls are super thick. They were protecting their food, which was totally necessary back in the day, and still in this day. But right now, like, this area is still fairly isolated, even with people moving into the area. But back in the day, this would have been a very isolated area. So they were pretty much on their own with growing food and doing what they could, because if it snowed, they were just here. They weren't going anywhere else. So this is the root cellar. It's pretty deep. It probably had stairs that went into it, and they could still be there. They just have gotten buried over the years. The walls are about 4 feet thick. They've kind of made them in a mound shape. And then you can see along the edges, they put some rocks, and that probably would have sat on top of the mound. And then I would guess that they probably had a wooden roof on top of it. And they might have had sod on top of that. But that was the most common style of root cellar in this area, especially for one that's just dug into the ground like this and not dug back into a hillside. So this is the root cellar. We haven't even touched that area yet or started digging in it. So hopefully we find some interesting things in there. All right, so we're gonna follow the pathway over here. And so here's a hole next to the root cellar. We did start digging in here a little bit. We thought, originally we thought this little hole might be an outhouse because it's fairly close to the house, but then we ran the metal detector over it and it started going crazy. So we dug a little bit and we found a bucket that's in there. So we think it's either some kind of a garbage or like burn pit, or it could have been a well. We don't know yet, so we have to keep digging in there to find out. We've just scratched the surface and just started digging out this bucket that's in there. But that's going to be an interesting one to find. There is a couple more indents kind of back that way. There definitely could have been an outhouse back there. And then there's another one to the other side of the house, which in my opinion is maybe more likely. But I have no idea. So several indents in the property that something must have been there at some time, or at least they were a garbage pile. So if we keep going on this pathway, it leads to this little area here. And I don't know if you can see because we're in the shade now, but it looks like just natural stone, but the pathway leads here. So we don't know if there was something on top of the stone at some point. It could be something. We have not brought the metal detector over here yet, but I was just sitting down on this rock for a second, and there is a really nice piece of porcelain, something just sitting on the ground right next to me. So there must be something over here. All right, we're gonna go over here to the last foundation before we head over to the barn. So I can't see the path going this way, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't. It's probably pretty buried. So this structure is pretty cool. So you can still see the foundation wall, and this was a pretty significant foundation for this structure. And then it continues on the other side, and then the entranceway. We believe this structure was probably a dugout. We're not sure why there's a dugout here or when they would have lived in it, but the entrance is not big enough to be like a garage or a place for a wagon or something like that. It's just not big enough. And then the other reason that we think it might be a dugout is that overall it would have been pretty wide if the walls weren't collapsed in, and we'll kind of be able to judge that more a little bit when we come in here and start digging a little bit more. But there's also support beams that are still in the ground. So if it had support beams, it probably had a fairly decent, fairly tall, for the structure that it is, roof on it. which makes it more likely to be a dugout. We've looked at some pictures of dugouts from this time period, and this shape and the size fit pretty well. So that is why we think that this probably is a dugout. We haven't done any digging in here yet at all, but I did find a really cool piece of a blue jar in the back, and there is part of an old lantern just right up here in the front. So I think that that's going to be a really interesting building to dig out. So that is the last of the foundations that are on here, and then we'll go over to the barn. And David's going to show you around the barn, which is really cool. The barn is the last structure standing that's here. And someday we're hoping that it might be able to be a barn again, but you'll see, it's going to take some work.
Check out this view that they would have had. Their house is behind the barn. But check this out. You can see for long ways in the valley there. This barn we hope to save. It looks a little bit rough, but most of it is because of just this wall right here, and it's bowed out kind of on the top. But overall, structurally, it's really not that bad. That second story of the barn kind of bows out right there, but you can see it's really not that bad. So we're going to try to save this. This is one of the coolest, I think is one of the coolest things about this barn, is they built it right against a rock wall. And so they added some rocks, but you can see like right here is all just natural rock, and then they added to it to build up the rest of the wall, which I think is really super cool. Here's a little tiny piece of pottery. It's just laying here, probably a plate or something. And then there's something really cool in here too. There's some, let's see if this will focus here. There's some old theater seats here. Little gold trim on there. Super cool. So over here, there's a hood to an old car. And then this is an old feed trough for hay. But look at this, they had notched out some square holes out of this. And they must have ran some sort of board in between it to keep the cows from going inside. It's an old trough, probably they use for grain. Here is an old crate. I looked this up. This is an old butter crate. Or no, this is an old lard crate. Swift's Silverleaf. Who knows how long this has been in here. But it's super cool. Stove foot here. So I just found this in the barn. It's an old gear of some sort, but it is not metal. And it looks like it's some sort of... my first thought was wood because it's pretty light. But you can tell here it's like, I don't know, it was formed somehow. So maybe some sort of composite, but if anybody knows what that is, that's super cool. So one other really cool thing about this barn, I think, is, so they had the ladder in the front there, right there, to get up into the loft. But then also, since they built this on a natural rock, it's not a cliff, but outcropping, my guess is that they had some sort of ramp to go from this rock right into the barn, which I think is really cool. So this is the loft, and like I said, where there's no roof, floor is really bad, so that needs all replaced. But the rest of this is pretty structurally sound. I'm walking on the floor trusses because I don't want to step on some rotten wood, but didn't find a whole lot of anything up here. Some old metal scraps and maybe some old lantern pieces or something, but some really thick glass there. I don't know, this is kind of sketchy over here. Some old screen. And there's pretty thick glass.
Okay, so I am just sitting here on this really cool rock that's right next to the barn, and it looks just like a seat. And so I'm sitting here thinking, like, back 100 years ago, somebody probably sat right here and looked out at this beautiful valley that I'm looking at now. And, you know, they were living this whole different life back, you know, in the early 1900s. And it's just crazy to put myself in those shoes and to think about that and to, like, be in the places that that family would have been in and sit in the places they would have sat in and walk in the places they would have walked in every day. And there was a whole life going on here. There was a whole story that was happening, that was unfolding, and it's just crazy to think about. And it's really cool that we get to be even just the smallest, minute part of that story by bringing it back to life again and sharing it with you. I just wanted to share a couple things that I had found when I was searching newspaper articles and trying to find more out about the Hendricks family. like I said, I haven't been able to see all of the newspapers yet from the time period that they would have lived here, so I'm sure that there's more information to be had, especially what happened kind of towards the end of their time here. But like I said, I did find out that they moved down here in 1910. Their neighbor helped them build their log cabin here. They had 3 children. They already had the children by the time they moved here. They didn't have any more children while they lived here. And their children were probably like elementary age when they lived here, or when they moved here, when they first moved here. I could see from the newspaper articles and the clippings that I found that education was really important to this family. They moved to South Dakota from Nebraska, and they lived in town for probably about a year or 2 before they actually moved down to their homestead claim. So there was several newspaper clippings that talked about their children's perfect attendance at the school in town. And I just thought that that was really cool to know, and that obviously if you are getting perfect attendance, especially back 100 years ago, like, education was something that you valued. So I thought that that was a really cool thing to know about the family. We do know that in this area there was 3 country schools. Maybe not all of them were going at the same time, but there was 3 country schools within the vicinity. So after they moved down to the homestead, then their kids would have went to one of the country schools, which I would say would be a smaller class, and it probably was a smaller class because all of the kids were in together. But from the newspaper clippings that I found, there was about 60 kids in this area that were going to school. So that's a pretty significant number back in the day, at least I thought. So they probably were in class with about 15 to 20 other kids in their little country school here. But like I said, it's really cool to look at those newspaper clippings and to think about the family that lived here and the people that visited them. One of the cool things that I read in one of the history books that I found at the library was that Mrs. Hendricks was very smart with healing and like probably herbal medicines and stuff. And if you had some kind of ailment, that you went to her. And so I'm kind of hoping that we find some of her little bottles here or something that she would have had, her little tinctures in or something. But it's cool to think about. It's cool to do that research and to really dig into what the family life would have been here. And then as we go through and we find stuff here on the homestead, whether it be broken pottery or just whatever is still left here, it's going to keep putting that picture together of not necessarily what the family was like, but what their daily life was like here in the early 1900s. Like I said, this was a really isolated place to live, so they were pretty much on their own with the help and support of their neighbors, but no family around. It was just this family trying to make it here on the frontier.
So that is our overview of the Hendricks homestead, and next time we are going to show you the other homestead on our property, which is the Reinhardt homestead. That's where we found the hand-dug well that's still there, and there's still a barn there and the foundation for the house and root cellar and stuff over there. So check out that video when it comes out. Make sure you like and subscribe so you get a notification. If you've enjoyed watching this, please share this video. And thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.